Okay, so I'm back downtown. We're in the elements here. I'm hoping it's not going to get too windy. We're in public, but we're safely social distanced as well. There might be a little traffic here and there, car alarms going off, etc. But yes, so we're trying to cover virtue theory as understood by Eleni Papali. Eleni Papali, who is a Greek professor who brings us Aristotle's virtue theory. Aristotle is an ancient Greek thinker who was alive from 385 BC to 323 BC. So he ancient Greek thinker. And so a couple things to keep in mind is that virtue theory is a non-consequentialist ethical theory. So in other words, the emphasis is on how it is that we're understanding a life of character, okay? And in contrast to basing the moral value on situations, okay? So remember that consequentialism, as with utilitarianism and ethical egoism, are based on the outcome or the consequences, where the moral value lies in the consequences, as opposed to virtue theory, which is non-consequentialist, so you're looking more at building a life of character, which is non-consequentialist, okay? So building a life of character is also building a life of good practice or practical way of understanding wisdom, otherwise known as phronesis. Also, we could think of some of the points or questions that Eleni Papali brings up as far as who am I, who ought I become, how ought I get there. So those questions are, and the answers that you come up with are ways that we're developing character, okay? And so character development toward a life of eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is an ancient Greek term where we're understanding that as life of character that is leading us to the good life, okay? And so when we're thinking of something that leads us to the good life, we have that echo that is reminiscent of natural law. So natural law is an extension of virtue theory, okay? And so natural law is an extension of virtue theory because it's getting us to a life toward goodness. And if I didn't point it out already, natural law is also non-consequentialist as well. And then likewise, we're going to be looking at feminism a little bit later. Feminism is also an extension of virtue theory, okay? So getting a little windy here, I hope that's not going to be too much. But yes, so feminism is an extension of virtue theory. And one thing that's common to all of these ways of thinking is our way of understanding ourselves communally, okay? So not only are you understanding a development of character by way of how it is that you're understanding yourself, that development of character is understood communally. In other words, how is it that you are in relation to yourself and others is a communal relationship. That's how you're developing your character and your ethics by way of virtue theory, okay? So when we're also understanding this, we must also see something that is intrinsic, like we were with natural law, and that which is intrinsic for virtue theory is likewise intrinsic for us by way of reason, okay? So in other words, reason is intrinsic to how it is that we understand our lives as humans for Aristotle, like it was for Aquinas. And so that is also front and center of how it is that we're understanding virtue ethics, okay? So understand that reason is key there. So the question is, how is reason key? Well, reason is helping us the way that we use our reasoning capacity as humans is getting us toward a life of goodness, a life of eudaimonia, okay? And so the way that we understand this drive toward goodness, this intrinsic way that we're understanding reason. So don't confuse it for instinct, because instinct is something that is not rational, but rather a way that we're understanding just a process of being, whereas with virtue theory, we're looking at reason as intrinsic, not to be confused with instinct, okay? So it's intrinsic to us as human beings because that's what's natural. So it's intrinsic, and we understand that by way of reason, and the way that we understand that by way of reason is through what's called the golden mean, okay? So the golden mean must never be confused with the golden rule, okay? And we're gonna look at the problems of the golden rule when we study deontology. I'm not gonna get into that now, other than to say, don't get it confused, the golden mean confused with the golden rule, okay? This is important. But the golden mean is there as a way to understand how it is that we're situating the way that we're looking at virtue, okay? So in other words, it's our reasonable way in which we understand virtue as a mean between two extremes, okay? So Papali gives us a diagram of the golden mean, so you could look at her essay. In it, she has a diagram of the golden mean there to show us that something like the virtue of courage is the mean between two extremes. So the virtue of courage is understood by way of reason as a mean between two extremes. So you have the excess of courage, which is being hasty, okay? So being hasty in the face of a difficult decision made in the face of danger, right? So that's courage. So courage is like having the ability to make difficult decisions in the face of danger. So an extreme of that would be making hasty decisions in the face of danger. So then a privation of that, or a lack of that, would be cowardice, right? So we're getting some wind here. We'll see if it passes. I'm hoping that it's not too loud over my cell phone mic. But yeah, so a privation of courage is cowardice, and so the way that we understand courage as having a goal, getting to a golden mean of courage, is by understanding that too little of it looks like cowardice, right? So that's what's really important there, is to not only understand the golden mean as a way of striking that balance between the extremes in order to understand what the virtue is, but also understand that that's a way that reason is making sense of how it is that it could work with something virtuously. And so when we understand something to be virtuous, we see that as excellence of character. So excellence of character is a way that we understand virtue, okay? And so see that also as a way that we understand our lives by way of developing a habit, okay? So in other words, we want to, when we are thinking of the good life, okay, and our development of character toward the good life, see that also as a way of developing good habits. So in other words, virtues are something that we want to develop habitually, so that it's easier for us, if we develop the virtues habitually, to become a life of goodness where we understand this as intrinsic. So the habits are ways of understanding our character and our character development as working through a life of good habits or excellent habits, okay? So think about that as a way that we're understanding practical life as well. So in other words, when we're understanding practical life, which is another way of understanding ourselves ethically. We're understanding our lives as a practice. So in other words, a life of character is one that is understood through practical behavior. So practical behavior, if we're understanding that communally, is a way that we're working in a community by way of excellence in a development of habit, okay? So in other words, that practical life is something that is made evident in our behavior communally, okay? So in other words, we're not going to understand our character until we understand our practice in our lives communally. So in other words, we don't know that way of being. We won't understand excellence of behavior till we understand our lives practically and in a community by way of reason. So that's the way that we want to understand virtue theory, as working rationally by way of virtue and by way of habit and by way of reason. Okay? So thanks.